Hey everyone, good morning or afternoon or evening, whatever time you are listening to this. Welcome to the Right Side Up with Daniel Strickland and James Scholl. I am James Scholl, and
I am
Danielle
Danielle Strickland.
is Danielle Strickland. And we've got quite a lot of background noise. Has anyone got a window open?
That's not me.
Hang on.
There we go. All right. Well, listeners, you'll be pleased to know that
Okay, look, it was a garbage truck. I can't control those people.
that's the okay. Do we also want to start this again, or do you enjoy the authenticity of it? All right, we're going to keep on going. Things go wrong sometimes, and we got to plow on. That's okay. However, today,
We're taking out the garbage, everybody. That's what we're doing.
That's it. There we go. Danielle is better at this than me.
It's a metaphor.
Look at that. Yeah, and it's going to come up a lot. Today, we are joined by...
James, just before you introduce the guest, I just want to give you a couple tips here as a person who's been leading for some time. You just roll with it, buddy.
Nothing
if you
is
don't point it
wasted.
out, people will question themselves, but not you know? So just, come on.
I don't want to gaslight them, man. Okay, right. So this is all intended. This is actually all scripted.
All
it
the
feels
best
unscripted.
podcasts have garbage trucks in them now.
Yeah, that's it. We've set a new bar today. That's the new
Feature,
expectation.
not a bug.
Am I busting the bubble of like me being in a studio somewhere or something?
I do like it when these things come in. If like you're just doing this for the money, I'm like, I'm not sure you're aware of the setup we're rocking right now. Okay, we're gonna power through because we're very, very excited to be joined today by our wonderful friend Brian Recke. Brian Recke will put out a book.
Welcome, Brian.
In September, the back end of September, called Hell Bent, which is now a bestseller. Yeah, that's exciting. Brian, why don't you take a moment to tell us about yourself? Tell us about your book. Yeah, there you go, handing up for those of you watching the video.
Wait. Before you do that, could I just say this, Brian? He's holding up a book in case you're listening to this, which is the vast majority of people. So Hell Bent. Wait, keep it up. I want to read the subtitle. Okay, that's how the fear of hell holds Christians back from a spirituality of love. Wow. So there's a lot to talk about. But this actually reminds me of that Simpsons episode. I don't know if you guys saw that one where Bart goes to Sunday school and he learns about hell. And then he just comes home and he just uses the hell word all the time. Like he's like, we're all going to hell and you're going to hell and we're going to go to hell. Have you seen that episode, Brian? I think it would go well with your book.
Viewing. What am I doing?
I was.
Yeah. And then like Homer's like stealing cable from the neighbor. And then like he has visions of going to hell because he's stealing cable. It's actually very apropos. But anyway, that's what's in my mind.
Brian probably wasn't allowed to watch Simpsons growing up. So.
Absolutely
Actually, it did have a harmful influence on my son. I will say that. I'm not joking. Anyway, carry on, Brian. It's over to you. Who are you? And tell us more about yourself. And if you're not following Brian on social media, he's a fascinating person to follow and is raising some really beautiful questions, which I'm a huge fan of questions, as is Jesus, by the way. And the perfect style of learning is to actually ask really good questions and not be afraid to answer them or to at least dive a little deeper. So I really appreciate, Brian, the way you shared your story transparently on social media and the way that you raise really good questions.
I appreciate
So
that, Danielle.
Tell us more.
Well, long story short, I am the son of a fundamental Baptist pastor. My dad is still an independent fundamental Baptist pastor in New York City. It's where I grew up. And I went to Bob Jones University, which is a fundamentalist college, where I began to question some of the fundamentalism. I think Bob Jones, well, we could talk about Bob Jones. There's a lot there. It's a dark place. The rules and then the narking, there's just the whole idea of spirituality there is you achieved spiritual maturity by like turning other people in for rule infractions. And that was how you were highlighted yourself as a spiritual leader. And this kind of very rule-based fundamentalism, very legalistic.
Unless, of course, it was like any sort of sexual ethic or misogyny or, sexual abuse, and then you don't turn anybody in.
Well, they didn't really have rules against, well, they did. They had rules
right.
You couldn't hold hands in the dating parlor. You had to be several inches apart. You had to leave room for the Holy Spirit. There was no
in the
kissing.
dating parlor.
They did have very, very strict rules around male-female contact, but there actually was a grace report. This is a few years after I left, so I wasn't at the school when this happened, but there was some sexual abuse stuff that was uncovered for sure, which is basically no surprise. But during my time at Bob Jones was when I say that that's my first step of deconstruction, was actually leaving fundamentalism and becoming a mainstream evangelical, which felt like a very big progressive move at the time.
How old were you, Brian?
It was happening during college. When I graduated, I was already going to an evangelical church. My senior year was actually one of my great rebellions was that I was going to a blacklisted church, because at Bob Jones, you were only allowed to go to other fundamentalist churches that didn't have contemporary Christian music. So I went to a church with like a drum set and like a band, which was against the rules of Bob Jones, actually. So it was basically like a gospel-centered evangelical church. By my senior year, I was getting pretty involved and listening to more mainstream evangelical voices like John Piper and Tim Keller, and even Rob Bell at the time was somebody
John Piper as a mainstream evangelical voice.
For sure. I
Wow.
mean, this is back, Mark Driscoll as well.
So you were in a cult. You were in a cult.
Which one? Fundamentalism or evangelicalism? Both?
Well, I mean, I think yeah, wow. Okay, carry on.
Well,
Actually, for our listeners, maybe this would be helpful. Like, what do you mean by fundamentalism?
Yeah, it's a good question. In many ways, evangelicalism, I would look at evangelicals and say that they are fundamentalists in their dogma because of the rigidity and exclusionary way that they hold their dogma. But the cultural distinction between evangelicals and fundamentalists has to do with cultural engagement. And so fundamentalists like Bob Jones, they really withdrew from society. And the evangelical movement, which was kind of Billy Graham and Bob Jones, are kind of the good type of fundamentalist versus evangelical, because Billy Graham was culturally engaged. He was more ecumenical. He would do events with other denominations, interdenominational, even though he still preached a pretty rigid gospel message based on the exclusivity of Jesus, inerrancy of scripture, etc., which are kind of fundamentalist tenets. But fundamentalists don't use the means of the world, which is why we were even against contemporary Christian music. So I'll tell people sometimes, like, Stephen Curtis Chapman and the Newsboys and Chris Tomlin was too progressive for me at Bob Jones. I wasn't allowed to listen to music like that, because that's using like the world's tools to kind of bring the gospel. So fundamentalism was like pure withdrawal. And so Bob Jones was like a bubble. So that's kind of the cultural idea of fundamentalism, is this very big distance between them and the world. Whereas evangelical, like Hillsong, Bethel, these movements want to appear very culturally engaged. They're going to wear cool clothes, have really good graphic design, it'll be very seeker sensitive in that way. We were not seeker sensitive in fundamentalism. So that would be kind of the cultural distinctive. Theologically, though, I mean, there really weren't that many differences, to be honest.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Brian, I want to get into a little bit of your book. So you were saying like your first step of deconstruction was leaving that like extreme fundamentalist sort of protect yourself from the world, and then moving into evangelicalism, which was at least a little bit like more progressive, and you had some space to listen to some other people and things like that. Tell me more, then carry on. What happened next?
Yeah, so I was enjoying my time in evangelicalism. It felt very spacious compared to what I was raised in, where, I couldn't wear jeans to church. I didn't have a beer, until my 21st birthday. Someone bought me one, and they didn't realize it was my first beer, and it was in like an IPA, and I couldn't finish it because I'd never had one. But as an evangelical, you could have an occasional beer. You could, even say some of the minor cuss words type of thing. So there was a sense in which you could be more normal. And that was enough for me for a little while. I was like, oh, this is so spacious, where I can be myself and be more normal, but I can still hold on to the theology that will keep the approval of the people who raised me and keep me kind of in the good graces of this general thing without having to question some of these main premises. And I would say, and then I became a pastor relatively young as well within evangelicalism at one of the churches that I was attending. They were looking to plant a site, and I got very excited about the idea of launching a new site. So I became a multi-site pastor in my young 20s. And it really was the 2015, the election, or really when Donald Trump became the front runner of the Republican Party, was the first time that my rose-colored glasses towards evangelicalism started to shatter a little bit. And I recognized that there was quite a bit of a distance between where I was at and where the movement was at that I wasn't really aware of. I think I was being quite naive towards the nature of the movement. And seeing, for instance, just in particular, like an Al Mohler, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a president of a large Southern Baptist seminary. He has a podcast called The Briefing, which had been a podcast I was listening to up until that first election, Trump's first election. And he gets into politics and cultural issues, and he was like a never Trump conservative for a while. But then as Trump gained steam, he flip-flopped and supported Trump. And watching that sort of thing happen in real time, watching different leaders that I had respected line up behind the Trump movement and the MAGA movement, which I could not square morally. I couldn't get there. To me, it was like, okay, I don't know everything. I haven't done the homework with politics. I feel like I've just been accepting a lot of what they're telling me, and I haven't really wrestled through a lot of this myself, but I know a bad guy when I see one. And I just felt like some things are morally obvious, and that felt very morally obvious to me, which felt like a bit of a shattering, which caused me to go and do my own homework on some of these things where I had been accepting what they were telling me that I was supposed to think and feel and believe about some of these things. And I realized, yeah, if that's where your moral intuition led you to line up behind this sexual predator, actually, because this, like, the Access Hollywood tapes were out. What we know now, we knew then. Yep. And that's what's so staggering about some of the people who are like, whoa, the Epstein files. We've known who this man is. And all of that was very clear to me, watching even people that I respected, to include my own dad, say things like, oh, the Access Hollywood tapes, that's just locker room talk, downplaying it. It was very, I would say, radicalizing for me, and caused me to enter a different space where I felt like a bit of a wilderness period from 2015-16 until 2020. I was still within evangelicalism, but began to feel more like an outsider, more like someone who was trying to push back against its worst impulses, do change from the inside. And I continued doing that kind of, preaching to a crowd that is listening to Fox News most nights of the week and challenging them to love their neighbors on Sunday mornings, until 2020 was a further shattering, I think, where I recognized that I needed to leave the movement altogether.
It almost feels apocalyptic in the best sense of the word, where like your journey, like I think one way of looking at deconstruction is like a death to, things that you thought or hoped, or your ideals, or naivety. I don't think there's that much wrong with being naive or idealistic. I think it's beautiful. I think it's our best. It's sort of like how abusers exploit the best of people. I think sometimes oppression always exploits the best of people. So sometimes I'm just like, what is it? Andy Grammer has a song called Naive. And it's like, if believing the best for people, if, hoping the best for the world is naive, then call me that. Go ahead. It's such a beautiful, but I also think it's apocalyptic in that it's the unveiling. It's like, maybe there's more going on. Maybe this is different than I thought. And maybe this is like, and I guess that's kind of what I want to actually ask you about Jesus, and why you even still contend for a message of Jesus. Like why, and we're going to get into your book on hell and the way that hell and the doctrine of hell is from hell and has fueled hellish behavior and results in hell on earth. We'll talk about that a little bit more, and I'd love to. But I wanted to start just with Jesus and your encounter or experience with Jesus, like how you've maintained that, and how do you keep what's true and good in the midst of like discovering what isn't?
There's been a lot of grief there. I think grieving has been a part of that process. I never deconstructed because of Jesus. I've never actually I've talked to so many people who are deconstructing, and never once has anybody said, I had to leave it all behind because I looked into it and that guy was just incredibly problematic. It's always the fact that churches are not living out a way that feels like Jesus. Actually, it's like, where is Jesus here? And the words of Jesus, the actions of Jesus, what I would say the spirituality of Jesus doesn't seem to be on display. And I began to feel very strongly that who we were in evangelicalism did not reflect the spirituality of Jesus. So that wasn't a Jesus problem. That was an evangelicalism problem. And a lot of that does have to do with a theology that is more concerned about the identity of Jesus and the dogmas that have been formulated around how to believe in Jesus and how we should hold the identity of Jesus and the transaction that Jesus performed for us on the cross, and how that sort of formulaically applies to us, that so much of my faith was about figuring out those dogmas and applying them, as opposed to actually living like Jesus lived, doing what Jesus did, loving like Jesus loved. I still am a Jesus person. What I'll say to people sometimes is, I have a lot of issues with the religion that has that has raised up around Jesus, but the spirituality of Jesus is still for me. And what I mean by that is I want to love God, myself, and others the way that Jesus loved God, himself, and others. And when I see Jesus living and loving, it's like that's what humanity is supposed to look like. I think Jesus showed us how to be human in a way that still deeply resonates with me. And so I've never actually questioned that. I put it on the table for the first time in my deconstruction to question it, because I think that in some ways, and a lot of this is also connected to hell and punishment. One of the problems with having a punishing view of God and a rigid sense of dogma and punishment existing outside the lines of dogma is that it makes it impossible to really question those beliefs, or to approach your spirituality with beginner's mind, with a blank slate at all. There's too much at stake. For many people, it's frightening. I even have heard this from people with my book, that I've heard people that they want to buy my book, but they're afraid, because the very act of purchasing a book like that is to maybe express the fact that I'm struggling with this framework. I'm experiencing doubt with this framework. And so to question hell, well, hold on, does that mean maybe I'll go to hell if I'm wrong? And so that control, that fear does cause people to not ask those kinds of questions. And so in my deconstruction, I did want to put it all on the table and say, okay, obviously we're all raised with a perspective. We all get a framework. None of us are a blank slate, but part of being in a fear-based system is you never have the opportunity to truly question that. And so for me, stepping out of that fear was actually putting it on the table and saying, is this authentic to me? And honestly, it wasn't hard for me to say, hey, a lot of this is going to remain an open question for me. I'm going to probably have some agnosticism towards a lot of this, but Jesus himself, I've very much always felt comfortable seeing him as a spiritual figure that I want to continue to follow. In other words, the good stuff is there. I don't have to culturally appropriate somebody else's religious tradition and be like, okay, well, maybe I'm a Buddhist now. I see some great stuff in Buddhism, but the great stuff is there in the way of Jesus. And so I kind of have tried to go deeper and deeper into my own tradition. Even though I'm holding things more loosely in many ways, I think we can still find it there in the Jesus way.
What are the ways that you do encounter Jesus? Like, what are your best practices that you have mined through and said, oh, I'm keeping this. This is meaningful to me in terms of connection with God?
Hmm. That's a good question. For a while in my deconstruction, I would say that prayer became somewhat difficult. I think that for many of us, our early mental models of God were so shaped by an authoritarian vision of God. And the primary metaphor of father, while I think I've begun to even reclaim that metaphor, but I had to take a break from the fatherly God, simply because of the Sky Daddy sort of intonations of this authoritarian punisher, really. My early mental models for God were formed by chick tracts. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but these drawings of this 1,000-foot tall, glowing, faceless man in a chair pointing away from him saying, "Depart from me, I never knew you," and sending people to hell. And this idea, I learned about hell really at the same time that I learned about God, when I was very young. And, for all the talk of a relationship with God, that relationship started out of fear of punishment. And so for me, my prayers were always, growing up, always to a very personal God, which can be quite beautiful. I believe that God is relational. In fact, I believe God is relationship itself. But I think in those prayers, they were directed towards a mental model of God that stopped working for me. And so as a result, praying in the same way felt difficult because of that shifting mental model. And so for a while, for a few years in the early parts of my deconstruction, I would say around, I don't know, 2021, 2, 3, I found my prayers to be more simple. I was really drawn to breath prayer and presence, and finding God in connecting to the present moment, into reality, into the world, into actually creation, and experiencing God in ways that were somewhat less personal and less like this big guy, because that had become, I think, an idol in some ways, because although there is something certainly relational with God, I think that idol view of a big punishing guy, I don't think that fully represents God. So I think that for a few years I was praying differently. And I would say in the last couple of years, I've begun to reclaim more personal prayers, although I still do really enjoy simply breathing and getting in touch with the present moment and my breath, and finding God in that way, which was a way that I was always told growing up. This is Easter, and this is opening yourself up to demons. I was told stuff like that. But I think
That's what's so incredible.
Yeah.
And I think what you've deconstructed really is just, you've gotten free from a punishing, fear-based idea of faith, right? And I think even what you're touching on is like how terrible that is, that you would hold a personal God with this punishing, angry, wrath-filled figure, like how, I mean, it really is just such a damaging view. It's a damaging formation so that it's really hard to recover one. You have to die to the one that isn't true, the false narrative of God being more like Moloch than Yahweh. But also to stay true to and to encounter the one who is love and the one who can drive out fear and the one who can embrace us when we feel lost and alone and the one who doesn't, who comes after us, who refuses to even leave us to our own devices and circumstances. I mean, to recover that and to die to the other, is, I think, my great desire for people who find themselves in a similar place as you, Brian. Obviously, your message is resonating and your story resonates with people who are like, hey, this is not tracking. But one of the things I really long for is that people would encounter the true, good, loving presence, of God. So they wouldn't have to think, oh, I'm all alone here.
I agree. I think God, in many ways, was more a limited idea, that certainly transcendent and above, but I wasn't taught to look for God within. I couldn't trust my own voice, my own intuition. And in some ways, I feel that I've connected more to God in the places of my own heart that I wasn't previously allowed to listen to. And then also in the voices of others. I have connected so much to God and really experienced Christ, I think Jesus at work, especially in voices. Jesus says that we'll find him always in the least of these, and spent his entire ministry with the people that were excluded by society. And we still live in a world that is shaped by white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, that silences certain voices and platforms and elevates other voices. And for me, I never questioned. I grew up in a very strictly male-only pastor sort of environment. And even out of fundamentalism, the evangelical spaces were soft complementarian, which only had male elders, although we'd have certain women that had the ability to speak every so often, but really only sort of this umbrella of authority.
Directors. Yeah, that's
And do the announcements.
And as a result, and I never questioned in many ways that of course God was basically a guy, because only guys speak for God. And to think that God, I mean, of course, I didn't picture necessarily God as a white guy, but it really was primarily white guys speaking for God. And so for me, I think I've also experienced Christ by simply trying to enter listening relationships with a posture of humility, especially with the people whose voices were not being platformed to speak for God. And so, I mean, at this point, so many of my friends, the people that I respect most speaking for God, are minority voices, women, queer people, people of color. And so I encounter Christ, especially where I find myself being challenged in areas of privilege that I need to divest from still. And that is what it looks like often to be called to take up my cross and follow Jesus. And so, yeah, I think listening to the voices that I wasn't allowed to listen to include my own, but also many of these other voices.
And it's literally just finding Jesus where Jesus tells you you're going to find him. Like it's right there. And again, I mean, I've just been pulling my hair out more and more recently about people that kind of talk about plain text reading. Well, I just do what the Bible says. And you're like, well, okay, go and hang out with the people you're not supposed to. That's what Jesus says every time. And yeah, Danielle, I recognize you've been doing this kind of work and working with very kind of marginalized people for decades, and I'm newer to it than you are. But as you say, just every time, I was at a memorial service for a friend of mine who'd spent a lot of his life incarcerated, but he found he robbed banks. Like, how do you think? Did you know people robbed banks anymore? Like, I think it's kind of cool.
One of the classic, very cinematic crime.
I know several bank robbers, James.
Do you? Oh man!
Wow.
He was
one a mother
fedoras,
and a son. One mother and a son. I married her twice, actually.
Oh yeah,
and
okay.
she and her son has some serious mental problems, and I mean, he's a genius. That kind of like Machiavelli, like really, we're in trouble because he's a genius.
If we could point you in the right direction, we'd be doing well.
Yeah, and they robbed, I don't know, like a lot, and then finally got caught like in a shootout. But anyway,
really?
Yeah.
My guy was, I mean, he kept going to jail for it, so I think he got better at the end.
Yeah. You're like, you might want to find a better profession just because you're not good at this one.
Like, I mean, the thing is, he was too brilliant for it too. But again, like the conversations I I had with him, yeah, just beautiful beyond words, right? And I really, there's always the encouragement that, yeah, you'll find Jesus where Jesus says you'll find him. Take Jesus at his word. That's all you need to do here. And then, yeah, maybe your heart will start to break a little bit more. And then and maybe I recognize if you're listening to this podcast, a lot of you may already be there, but for some of you, that may be a bit more difficult. And I want to honor the fact that it does take courage to step outside that comfort zone. It is frightening to be like, well, if I take another step, I might come back. And you might be right, but it's so worth it. I think this is a thing, and we're hearing this from Brian, that like your life has been transformed in this incredible, beautiful way because you went to find Jesus where Jesus said you'd find him.
Yeah.
That's great. And
Yeah, I
also,
think
I
so.
feel like one of my favorite deconstruction books I recommend is Brian Zinnen's When Everything's on Fire.
Well, I haven't read
I
that
don't know if
one.
you've, oh, I highly
I've read a
recommend
few of
it.
his books, but not he has a lot. I haven't read that
Yeah.
one.
It's
I
like,
like
it's what he
Brian, though.
does or something.
It doesn't
Yeah.
miss though.
But that book, what it does is it kind of like the floor falls out, from under you. That's what it feels like when you're deconstructing. It's just like everything that you stood on is like falling. But what he does is he's like, oh, great, because underneath that is like even more of a beautiful, like a place you can land softly in the arms of a wide, beautiful God. So it's actually quite a beautiful, it kind of just, feel like it just gives a lot of peace to the fact that this is thousands and thousands of years that people have been wrestling with and, creating these structures and then tearing those structures down because they don't work or they serve the wrong way or they serve themselves at the expense of their created purpose. And then it becomes demonic, all the things. It's such a beautiful, and that's kind of what I hear in your story is like, we're all afraid because we're like, oh, what will happen when I lose this? But then actually
Right.
in the losing, we gain so much more insight and so much more depth, which is, of course, the invitation Jesus gave at the beginning, right? Is that if you lose your life, you'll find it in him. So that's a really fascinating. Okay, let's talk about hell. Hell, 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 like Bart Simpson. And we've had several, no one will be surprised here. We've had several episodes with Brad Jersek
Oh,
in
fun.
this, over the years. And we did one with Aaron White on harrowing hell, the idea of Jesus emptying it forever and on Easter and all that jazz. It was our favorite Easter theory. Anyway, what I love of your approach is that this idea of hell as this punishing is actually traced, that belief system is actually indicative of the means by which we even tell the story, so that it kind of like infects. So this like, they would call it a doctrine, but this like crazy over weird belief of a God who can't wait to eternally punish anyone that disagrees or does the wrong thing or whatever kind of infects every operating system of that belief system. And that's what I love even about your subtitle, where you're making the connect. This isn't just a conversation about like, does hell exist? This is a conversation about hellish behavior and how that hellish behavior is punishing and threatening and fear-based and is quite literally the opposite of the good news. Tell me more about that discovery you made in the book that you've written.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. In my deconstruction, having so many conversations with others, hell was one of the early things that I began to take apart. But what I found, and I found this even in myself, was that it's not just as easy as just taking hell out of your theology and carrying on like everything else is unchanged, because so much of the story of Christianity that many of us learned was a story about punishment, about a God who was bound to punish. And unbelievers, particularly anyone who's not a Christian, would be punished. And really the way to become a Christian was that Jesus gets punished in your place, so that at the end of the day, everybody's got to be punished. Somebody's got to be punished. And it's either you or Jesus. And so the punishment in that framework is kind of driving the bus of the whole story of the gospel. So where does the punishment land?
Punishment actually has greater authority than God in that situation as well.
Right. Love
God
is not the primary.
God has no choice but to punish. There is a higher agency than God, and his name is punishment and vengeance. Sorry,
And I think
can't.
It's a total misunderstanding of the gospel in many ways. I was told things like, yeah, God can't just forgive our sin. It has to be paid for, which is funny because actually the Lord's Prayer, it's right in there. It says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, not pay our debts as we pay our debtors. Debt forgiveness is not the same thing as debt payment. That's a cancellation. God can actually just wipe out debt. It doesn't have to all be paid down to the penny. God is not an
Literally,
exacting
I'll
right.
forgive you for my name's sake. I'll forgive you because I want to. God just like says
Right.
that a bunch in the Old Testament as well. Before Jesus has come and done his thing, it's like, so it just blows my mind. I'm like, can you not just accept that God wants to forgive people and can?
Yeah, but James and Brian, I will say this. I preached on Daniel 12 on Sunday and been reading Revelation as well. So this is really interesting. I remember actually reading this in Exclusion and Embrace.
Yeah, Wolf.
Who's the
Yeah,
guy that wrote
Miroslav
that?
Wolf.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember him saying, and he's sitting there with like genocide survivors and like people whose relatives have been chopped up in front of them and tortured. And he said, I could not actually just say to these people in the idea of presenting a good God that everyone will just be forgiven. He's like, that's not good news to people who are under the boot of oppression. The news is God is just, and righteousness is something that God requires. And what's been really helpful to me is this idea that the judgments of God, even that are coming, that all the hidden things will be exposed, all those things will happen, that the judgments of God are actually a righteousness coming too. Like that the fire is actually a refining fire. That so that this idea that we thought the fire was going to be a destructive and punishing fire, that actually the fire is still coming. Everyone will have to go through sort of a refinement or a judgment, but the judgment is for our redemption, is for our best. So it's going to, reveal. So what is it, that book? Did you read the book, The Pastor by
Just second.
Brad?
Paul Young. Yeah.
Yeah, and Paul Young.
Yeah.
Have you guys read that book,
Okay.
The Pastor?
Yeah.
I highly recommend the audio version of it because it's anime. It's what do you call that when it's
It's like
enhanced?
voice
William
acted,
Paul
yeah.
Young? Is that the pastor?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I highly recommend it because it basically is this novel. It's pretty short, but it's a novel about this pastor who's a terrible guy and ends up in a psych ward and all this stuff. And basically it's about the fire of God coming for him, but in a way that is like excruciating on so many levels, because it's truth telling, because it's like confrontation. If you've ever gone through or walked with anyone through treatment, a detox and all the kind of stuff, this is like this good for you, clean life is actually the most painful process you'll ever go through of transformation. So anyway, it's been helpful to me because I actually, as someone who has worked with people who want and need justice, and I remember Psalm 97, it says the righteous will be glad at the judgments of the Lord. And I remember thinking like, oh gosh, I've never been glad about judgment. Like I've always been on the wrong side of it in terms of like, I've always been like, when Jesus is coming, I'm going to be in trouble. And that's partly this horrible teaching that God is coming to punish. Like I had a revelation of like, my mom used to say, wait till your dad gets home, because he was bringing the punishment, which is like such a sad concept, and now I'm like, yeah, just wait till my dad gets home. I can't wait because he's going to make things right, and it's not going to be punishment. It's going to be justice. And so anyway, I think it's important to say that. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, there's so many threads here. I love this conversation. I do think you got to it right at the end a little bit. I think one of the things that we have to do, especially in America, we often treat justice and punishment like synonyms, as if like to do justice was served. What we're really saying is somebody got punished, as if those were the same things. And I think one of the things I would want to do is really decouple those two concepts, that God's justice is God's righteousness, which is God's ability to make things right. And you said it, that God makes things whole, bringing about shalom, which does involve accountability and things coming to light, certainly. But the end result of God's justice is not torture and punishment. The end is the beloved community. The end is reconciliation. The end is kinship, that we are all brothers and sisters. Because the reality is, yes, have people been harmed? Has cruelty been visited against us? Of course. But also, we have been cruel. And every single often victim we see throughout history often then becomes a perpetrator in different ways. That line between good and evil runs down the line of each person. And so to have punishment exacted on our enemies, that ultimately will come on us as well, that ultimately I don't think that's the end for us. Actually, God wants us to move beyond that. So,
and that's also, Brian, just to also say, like, the people are not the enemy. like that's also that, because that's that teaching that God
We
is
wrestle
mad at
not with flesh and
people.
blood,
Right. So that's that
principalities and
weird
powers.
hellish idea that like God is mad at people.
Right.
Right. And it's like, no, God is mad. He is angry at sin and death and hell and demonic principalities and powers that use and exploit and oppress and kill people. So it's like there is a vengeance, but it's just not coming for people. People are the folks caught.
In so many of the apocalyptic books of the Bible, you see empires represented by these beasts, right? In Daniel and in Revelation, that really
Yeah.
one of the main storylines of the Bible that you're not hearing at all in fundamentalism or hardly at all in evangelicalism is God versus not individual sinners, certainly not gay people, but God versus empire, God versus these systems of domination that tend to favor certain people and hold other people down into the dirt, and that God
Yeah.
will dismantle and destroy, and yes, even cast into hell these systems of domination, so that the end again is beloved community and kinship.
Yes. Yes. So in
And so
many
it's a
ways, I
different
feel like the
story.
doctrine of that hell stuff is like in a classic demonic strategy has been twisted to be used against the people when actually all of that judgment stuff, it is always meant to be used against the systems and the principalities and the powers that actually exploit, kill, steal, destroy the people. So it's just an interesting, anyway.
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
the other thing that it does is it really moves the main realm of spirituality from this life to the afterlife. Because I actually believe that the primary way Jesus is using Gehenna, which is the word translated hell, is an apocalyptic metaphor for the results of our failures to love and build the kingdom of God that Jesus is calling to. It is the natural consequences of that experience in this life, not the next life. And when we talk about these spiritual metaphors, I love spiritual metaphors. I love talking about, when I see something bad happen, I'm the first to say that's demonic. But that spiritual language can be helpful when it reminds us that our actions and this world and the societies we create and how we treat people have spiritual consequences. Everything is spiritual, but that can be really unhelpful when it feels like spiritual bypassing, which pushes towards a sort of pie in the sky spirituality, that the main purpose is being a Christian, being on the right side of the line of whether you're saved or unsaved so that you can go to heaven when you die. And unfortunately, when something like hell in the afterlife looms that large, a lot of times what I see in evangelicalism is a real difficulty of getting traction on social justice issues. Like you'll see this, for instance, even a popular figure like a Tim Keller, who used to be one of my favorite pastors in that world when I was in it, primarily because he did, while still holding to the evangelical traditional form of the gospel, he also talked a lot about social justice. He wanted to kind of hold both of them, but he always had a hard time for that really gaining traction. And even he had many critics, even in the Gospel Coalition, which is one of the movements that he founded. Kevin DeYoung, which was another Gospel Coalition writer, wrote a book called What is the Mission of the Church? Saying the mission of the church is converting people, is getting people saved because hell is hot. And so you can, talk about social justice and you can feed a bunch of hungry kids, but if those hungry kids don't get the gospel, then they might have full bellies, but they're going to go to hell. And so when the stakes are that high, it is always going to be very hard to center issues of justice, issues of peace in the world. And as a result, the spirituality that I inherited had almost nothing to do with the future of the planet, the fate of the human species and who we are becoming, the kind of societies that we create. Some of the biggest questions, that wasn't really what it was about.
The
It was
end of
primarily
poverty.
about getting saved.
Right. The end of poverty, economic
Or you'll always
reform.
have with you is what they'll say as soon as you bring that up.
And it's like I was reading this the other day. Yeah, the pool will always be with you. It's from Deuteronomy. Jesus is citing Deuteronomy 15, I think, there. And it literally says, and so be generous with them. It's like, it's so fascinating that they use it as like, well, there's nothing you can do. And it literally, Jesus is citing scripture that says, you are always going to have the poor people with you. And that's why you must always be generous to them. Like, that's convenient how you forget that part. I think, as you say, Brian, when the stakes are so high, it just makes it so easy to ignore everything else. So, I mean, and again, I don't want to, I want to acknowledge the consequences of sin. I want to acknowledge the way that God's heart breaks over injustice and the ways that sometimes we treat one another, and especially the way that powerful people treat powerless people. And this too can be used as a kind of excuse to go, well, we could have accountability for this pastor, but then, but it'll hurt his ministry. I mean, I feel Danielle has dealt with this like constantly, that it's like we could come forward, well, no, but then more people might not be saved. And so there
Right.
should be no accountability either. Because again, the stakes are so high. Well, nothing could be worse than burning forever. Therefore, we don't need any accountability. And it's so, I have my issues with
No,
that too.
that logic is used as a trump card very frequently. Afterlife
No pun
logic.
intended. No
Yeah.
pun intended. Literally, that logic is used as a trump card.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
that's where that breakage began to take place for you, is that we can excuse this because our
He's on our
agenda.
side.
Yeah. And also, like, this idea of like protecting the church and
Mhm.
like getting the church to rise so the message could get out.
Exactly.
No matter who it hurts, no matter what it compromises, no matter how many of these values don't look like Jesus, we get this gospel message. I'm using my quotation fingers for people listening. This gospel message, which what kind of gospel is that?
You're right.
The
end of the
powerful
gospel,
protecting the
hope
powerful.
was very much, you could excuse a lot if it was giving power to Christian institutions, because those Christian institutions have the gospel. We have the keys to heaven and hell. The rest of the world is going to hell in a handbasket. We have
Yeah.
the gospel. So if a politician is going to give us power, that's good for the world because we're going to bring salvation to the world. So in other words, the end goal is not the flourishing of human bodies. It is the flourishing of Christian institutions.
Yeah, with this idea that like the eternal message is more important, but really it's just like a scapegoating of their own behaviors and desires, right? What are your best? Okay, so guys, get this book, because I imagine, Brian, you're breaking down in the book the
Yeah.
specific scriptures that people use to say, no, this is, dogma.
Yeah, so I only have a few I have one chapter about what the Bible says about hell. I have another chapter that's like a case for universal salvation. The first few chapters of the book, I actually talk a lot about just how this formed us, what happened to us, how this shaped our spirituality, how this punishment-oriented, afterlife-oriented faith that many of us inherited shaped our views of God, ourselves, and other people. And I think just naming that has been really validating and helpful for people, because I think for a lot of people, that's what Christianity has been to them. And it's, as a result, they don't know how to disentangle that necessarily, because they'd like to still follow Jesus. Again, it's not like Jesus himself was offensive to them. They could see the power of Jesus's spirituality, but this idea of having to believe the right thing or you're going to go to hell really has a way of swallowing up the message. And so I really do hope to kind of disentangle that. And then in the second half of the book, I really ask some questions because, it's questions that I get from people. And it's questions that I had, like, okay, if there's no hell, then what's the point of Jesus? Because for a lot of people, that's the point of Jesus, is to save them from hell. If there's no hell, why did Jesus die? Because again, isn't that why Jesus died, to save us from hell? If there's no hell, do people even have to become Christians? Isn't that like our mission, to try to evangelize the world, get everybody to become a Christian? But if there's no hell, then like what's the point? So for a lot of people, hell gave us our spiritual marching orders. It gave structure and purpose to our spirituality. And when we take that out, it's like, what am I doing this for? What is the point of this? Which to me was so revelatory that, we have a very vapid foundation. If that's what it is, then that's not a spirituality. That's punishment avoidance. Because spirituality to me is about love and connection. And you don't get there from punishment avoidance. That's just fear. That's behavioral control. That's manipulation. And so for me, this whole journey has been really even discovering a spirituality within Christianity, where before I think I didn't really have one.
It also, like, it strikes me as, well, one, crazy sad that that's the reality, right? That people are just trying to avoid punishment as a life instead of this beautiful desire to serve and love and connect, right? So, in part of me, I get a little bit nervous sometimes because I think, like, I want people to know Jesus because Jesus is good, right? Like, I want people to know Jesus because when they're alone or they can't find peace or they're struggling with anxiety, that presence in my life has been a remedy for me. It's helped me, and it helps me free myself from myself even. So like I that's why I think the message has never been more needed in terms of God is real and God is love and God is for you and God is with you. I don't think the world has ever needed that message more. And it scares me because I think we we've so attached that message to this one framework that we lose this framework, and then we lose the whole. Then we're just like, well, everyone can just do what they want. And I get a little bit like, well, sure, everybody could do what they want. Like, it's not my job to police anybody, but I do still want to tell them. I do still have good news. Like I still am excited about people encountering a God who's real.
And it is good news, isn't it? I guess that's a thing for me, that this revelation of who Jesus is, and I continue to be charmed and excited. I love to preach because I just get to learn more about Jesus and share more about who Jesus is. And that is good news. So I want people to know it because it is good and it is beautiful and it is true. And it's fascinating to me that, is that not enough? Is that not enough? Like, the fact that something is good and true and beautiful, is that not enough?
Well, and then when you take fear and punishment out of the equation, even just for a little while, like if you can just practice this, actually, even in your own life, if you're scared, if this is all scary for you, just take fear and punishment out of the recipe for a little bit and relax into the love of God. And then what's happened for me in my life is that I'm just like, oh, wow, like this is better than I thought. Like, God is better every day. Like every couple weeks, I'm always like, whoa, this is mind blowing. Like, this is better than I ever even could have imagined. Yeah.
I think a lot of people do push back and say, well, it can be both. Like there's a punishment, there's hell, but also, of course, it's good. And of course, like God and Jesus are good in and of themselves, and, grow in love. And yeah, like they just don't know that they can also take away the punishment. And I guess what I would say is that it really is hard to have both of those, because as soon as you add, it's good, it's beautiful, it's flourishing, it's wonderful, and you have to do it or else. As soon as you add that last part, I do think it has a way of spoiling everything that came before that when you add the or else, especially when we're talking about not just like a small or else. We're not talking about like, or else you're going to get a slap on your wrist. We're saying, if you don't do this, you're going to burn for all of eternity. And after 10 trillion years, it's only just getting started, baby. So in other words, it's the worst possible thing that could ever happen to anyone for the longest possible amount of time. And that's if we don't get the right religion, if we don't believe the right things. And so all of a sudden, when you put that big of a threat on top of the pursuit of love, it makes it really hard to pursue love for love's own sake. You just can't do it under threat of punishment.
Yeah, guys, watch Beauty and the Beast. Hello.
Brian,
Say more about that. Connect that to the story for us.
Well, she's a captive.
Right. It's when she's free that she can love.
Right. And not until the threat and punishment, and which actually it really kind of is a story of abuse, and it's kind of twisted, so I don't want to use it as an example.
She also sees that he's not like a monster, right? That's the thing. The reason why she's so scared is because what she's been told about this is not...
And how he even acts.
And then even he thinks he has to control, or he won't be loved. And I have to punish or control in order to get love. That's not the way into love. That's not how you get there.
Yeah.
Right. You could have like a little movie guide, discussion guide attached to your book, Brian. I feel like this is like revelatory.
Just Beauty and the Beast.
Beautiful. No, I love
it's like
that.
We make God Beauty and the Beast. Like we make God the beast, and then we love him even though he's a beast. Do you know what I mean? Like, and actually that's not a real relationship, everybody.
And it was fueled by deep insecurity.
Fear, insecurity. Yeah. I will never forget the podcast we did with Brad where he shared how he just couldn't connect with God. And his spiritual director at the time said, so let me get this straight. Like, you think God is angry and needed to punish his own son in order to love you. And he's like, yeah. And the guy's like, oh, you're trying to connect with Moloch, not Yahweh. You have the wrong God. And that was I can never lose that image of like, we are trying to connect with the wrong God most of the time, because we want our human familiarity is we want kind of to be punished. We want, we want control. We want a God in our own image. We want someone that needs vengeance. We want someone that has to be appeased, even though it's deep, but like we make this God in our own image. And then of course we can't connect, and there's no transformation or intimacy or freedom because we're connecting to Moloch. Holy.
Wow. That's true. It is, however, hard to break from because it is providing a lot for us in terms of safety, believing that I'm in, even if other people are out, I'm secure because I'm believing the right thing. So I'm on the right side of that line. And so we settle for kind of the idea that, well, we're the right religion. We're going to go to heaven. And we settle for that as opposed to this uncontrolling, loving relationship, this very wild, gracious, spacious relationship that would demand that we lay down our own punishment as well.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that David Bentley Hart says in That All Shall Be Saved. So if you read Brian's book, and everyone should because it's brilliant, and so is he, if you're like, I need more arguments, I need more proof, and I need stuff to go back with, two books that I think we all recommend are That All Shall Be Saved by David Bentley Hart and Her Gates Will Never Be Shut by Bradley Jersak. Both brilliant in their own right and own way. We do love Bradley here, though. One of the things that David Bentley Hart says is that deep down, actually not as many people believe this as they think they do, because there's no way you'd have children. Like, if there is a chance, like if there is a 1% chance that your child would burn forever, no one would take that risk. Like, deep down, people don't believe this as intensely as they think they do. And it's quite interesting. But then, of course, you're stuck in this kind of dissonance. I think, Brian, one of the things I've really enjoyed is you sharing a lot of the feedback that you've been getting from this book and how ultimately liberating it's been for people. What are some of the things that have really surprised you about, those DMs that you get?
Well, I think the one that was the most surprising, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, was the number of people who really struggled to even pull the trigger on purchasing it.
Sure.
One person shared with me that they had to kind of trick their brain and tell themselves, okay, I'm allowed to buy this book and just expose myself to the information. And that doesn't mean I have to agree with it. I'm not agreeing with it. I'm just buying it. And then they bought it and they shared that with me. And I was like, fascinating. So I screenshotted that and shared it with my audience. And I was like, is this a relatable experience? How many of you that bought my book had like some religious guilt and panic rise up in you at the very act of buying a book that's questioning the existence of hell? And the response to that poll was, it was about 70% of people said that they experienced some sense of like, am I allowed to do this? At the very act of questioning that framework, which again, it's not like we're questioning, is God loving or is Jesus real?
Yeah.
We're saying, does God punish people? But it kind of does tell you how instrumental it is to the control of it.
Yeah. And Brian, I was going to say this fear that people have it's not pretend, it's real. They've watched people be vilified. Like they've watched as people who have asked really good questions. I mean, this is the kind of the history of the institutional church is to like kill its heretics. And in contemporary, even in our lifetime, people have been vilified and killed virtually and remain so. You become an enemy of the institution, and then so this isn't just like people going, ooh, I'm afraid, and it's internalized fear. It's like, of course they're afraid. They also could be rejected. They could be excluded. And then I would say, oh yeah, welcome to Jesus. Welcome to that. Oh, you're going to encounter Jesus here because also this is what he promises, is this like, you're going to be written off and excluded and marginalized because you're with me. And so it's also that part of that, like, I like to tell people, like, keep following that, like that risky, and again, Jesus's favorite technique in the scriptures for teaching is questions. It's his favorite by far. So if you're not able to question, maybe it's not Jesus that you're following, because that's his favorite way.
Yeah. And of course, I know that same feeling because I sat in that for quite some time. I remember when I was in evangelicalism, how we would speak about people who got more progressive in some way, or, maybe left and became Episcopal. And it was like they weren't even Christians anymore, right? Oh, they're like quote unquote Christians, they're like liberal Christians. We're not sure if that counts. And it was scary when I realized that I was going to have to break with it and go on a bit of a journey. I recognized like, oh, they're going to talk about me. They are going to perceive me in this way. And that was an uncomfortable thought, to think that these people who I've done life with, who were there when my kids were born, who helped me move, who I've been pastoring alongside, are going to think of me as a backslider, as basically not a believer, as even a false teacher. And so all those things, that did happen. And I will say that the loss of belonging is the hardest aspect of deconstructing. And I just have not regretted it, though. I think as you step into authenticity, and especially you find new people to belong with in often deeper ways, because you're able to show up as your full self. And so that belonging is more meaningful because it's not like a pretend version of you that's
It's not
trying to fit
conformity,
inside the box.
it's genuine belonging, right? Well, I pray that for you. I pray that this book helps other people get bold and risky and really also desire a faith that is genuine and open and spacious. And, ironically, one of the words that describes salvation in the Bible is a spacious place.
Hmm.
I think about that a lot in terms of how we make it this small, tiny, conform yourself into this like tiny little, and actually the word itself means to like bring you out and into spacious places. So I pray it'll help a lot of people find that.
Me
Brian,
too.
plug us your pluggables.
Well, you can grab the book anywhere books are sold. It is on sale on Amazon right now for pretty cheap. But if you want to join in some sort of economic blackout, then maybe go to a local bookstore and get it
We
instead.
can't recommend that enough.
Yeah. But I'm a big poster on Instagram at Recker is where you can find me, Berecker. I also write pretty regularly on Substack. Beloved with Brian Recke is the name of my Substack, where I do cultural commentary, personal essays, sometimes scriptural meditations, kind of whatever I'm feeling like writing. So you can follow my writing.
That's great. Thanks for all you're doing, Brian. Keep it up. And yeah, we're over here cheering you on.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. It was a really fun conversation.